The wind howled like a wounded beast across the endless white expanse, whipping snow into her face until her cheeks burned raw and numb. Eliza clutched her two children closer, little Samuel's small frame shivering against her side, his mittened hands buried in the folds of her woolen coat, while baby Clara whimpered faintly in the sling across her chest. The wagon had broken an axle. Miles back, the horses spooked and bolted into the storm, leaving them to trudge on foot, through drifts that swallowed their legs up to the knees. Each step was a battle, her boots heavy with ice, her breath coming in ragged gasps that froze in the air before her. The plains of Montana stretched indifferent and vast, a frozen sea, where the horizon blurred into nothingness and the cold seeped into her bones like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. She had thought the journey west would mend what was broken, but now it seemed only to bury it deeper. Her husband's death 6 months prior had left her with debts and whispers in the Iowa town they'd called home. Whispers of a woman too proud to beg, too stubborn to remarry quickly. The children were her anchor and her ache. Samuel at 7, with his father's solemn eyes asking questions she couldn't answer, and Clara barely 2, whose cries pierced the silence like accusations. Eliza's hands, chapped and bleeding from the rains, trembled as she adjusted the blanket over them. The snow fell thicker, now blanketing the world in a hush that muffled even her own heartbeat. She stumbled, falling to one knee, the impact jarring through her, and for a moment she considered staying there, letting the white claim them all. But Samuel's voice, small and quivering, pulled her back. He didn't speak, only pressed his face into her thigh, his body a tiny furnace against the chill. She rose, teeth gritted, and pushed forward, the wind tearing at her bonnet until it flew away like a lost bird. Memories flickered unbidden. The warmth of the farmhouse kitchen, her husband's rough laugh as he swung Samuel high, the scent of fresh-baked bread mingling with pipe smoke. Those days had crumbled when fever took him swift and merciless, leaving her to sell what little they had for passage on the train, then the stagecoach, and finally this forsaken wagon trail toward a cousin's ranch that promised work and shelter. Promises she thought bitterly, as fragile as the ice crusting her lashes. The storm intensified visibility, shrinking to arm's length, and Eliza's mind wandered to darker places. What if they perished here, bodies found come spring thaw, frozen in embrace? The thought clawed at her, visceral and cold. But she shoved it down, focusing on the rhythm of her steps. One then another, the children her only tether to life. Clara's whimpers grew weaker and panic surged in Eliza's chest, hot and urgent. She sang softly under her breath, an old hymn her mother had taught her, the words lost to the gale, but the melody a faint thread of comfort. Hours blurred into eternity. Her legs ached with fire, her vision spotting black at the edges. Then, through the swirling veil, a shape emerged, a dark silhouette on horseback, materializing like a ghost from the white. Eliza halted, heart pounding, unsure if it was delirium or deliverance. The figure drew nearer, the crunch of hooves on snow cutting through the wind's roar. A man bundled in furs and oilskin, his hat pulled low against the onslaught. He reined in his horse, a sturdy bay that snorted clouds of steam, and dismounted with a grace born of long habit. His eyes, sharp and blue beneath the brim, swept over her, and the children taking in their plight without a word. He moved closer, boots sinking into the drift, and extended a gloved hand. No questions, no preamble, just that simple gesture, steady amid the chaos. Eliza hesitated, her arms tightening around Samuel. But the cold had sapped her strength, and trust, in that moment, was all she had left. She nodded faintly, and he lifted Samuel onto the saddle first, then helped her up behind Clara, still nestled against her. His horse plodded onward, the man leading on foot, his broad shoulders breaking the wind like a bulwark. They rode in silence, the storm raging around them, until a dim light pierced the gloom, a cabin squat, and weathered smoke curling from its chimney like a promise kept. He pushed open the door, ushering them inside, where warmth from a pot-belly stove greeted them like an old friend. Eliza sank to the floor, peeling off wet layers, her fingers clumsy and blue. The man busied himself with wood and kettle, his movements efficient, sparing. She watched him through exhaustion's haze, noting the lines etched around his eyes, the quiet economy of his actions. Who was he, this stranger in the wilderness? But questions could wait. For now, the fire's crackle and the children's softening breaths were enough. As the night deepened, memories resurfaced in fragments: her wedding day under Iowa skies, vows spoken with youthful certainty, the telegram from her cousin urging her west, the stagecoach driver's warning of early snows. She had ignored it all, driven by a desperation that now felt foolish. The cowboy, for that's what he was, with his weathered chaps and Colt at his hip, handed her a tin cup of broth, steam rising like prayers. Their eyes met briefly, a spark of something unspoken passing between them. Samuel stirred, murmuring thanks, and the man ruffled his hair with a gentleness that surprised her. The frontier never sleeps on Wild West Chronicles. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, its single room warmed by the iron stove that glowed cherry red in the corner. A narrow bunk stood against one wall, a table scarred by years of use, and a shelf holding tin plates, a coffee pot, and a worn leather-bound Bible. The air smelled of pine smoke, coffee grounds, and something faintly of saddle leather. Eliza sat on the edge of the bunk with Samuel curled against her side. Clara, already asleep, in her lap, cheeks flushed from sudden heat after the long cold. Her own hands still shook, though whether from lingering frost or the shock of being alive, she could not say. The man whose name she learned when he spoke at last was Caleb, moved with the deliberate care of someone accustomed to silence. He hung their sodden coats and blankets near the stove, stoked a fire until sparks danced up the chimney, then filled the kettle from a bucket of water that had not yet frozen solid. When he offered the broth again, this time with a heel of cornbread, she accepted it wordlessly. The first swallow scalded her tongue, but the warmth spread downward like sunlight breaking through clouds. Samuel ate, slowly watching Caleb with wide, wary eyes. "You're a long way from anywhere," Caleb said at length, his voice low and gravel rough, the kind that carried over wind without effort. He remained standing back to the wall, arms crossed loosely. Not crowding them, giving space. Eliza swallowed. "We were headed for Bitterroot Valley. My cousin has a place there. Work promised." The words sounded thin even to her own ears. Caleb nodded once, as though the information settled somewhere inside him without surprise. "Storm came early this year. Trails are gone under 3 feet of snow already. You're lucky the horses threw the wagon where they did. Another mile and you'd have been past my line shack." She looked at him, then really looked. Mid-30s perhaps, though. The plains aged a man fast. Dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples, a jaw shadowed by several days' growth eyes, the pale blue of winter sky after a norther. A thin scar curved along his left cheekbone, old enough to have paled to silver. His hands, when he reached to take the empty cup, bore the marks of hard labor, calloused knuckles, thickened, one finger crooked from an old break. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but all she had. He gave a small shrug, the motion almost imperceptible. Any man would have done the same. She doubted that. Most men she'd known would have weighed the trouble against the reward and ridden on. Night settled heavy outside, the wind still keening around the eaves, but inside the cabin, the world shrank to the circle of firelight. Caleb unrolled a second blanket and spread it on the floor near the stove for himself, then sat cross-legged to mend a torn rein with waxed thread and a bone needle. His fingers moved steadily, practiced. Samuel, exhaustion loosening his caution, edged closer. "You ride that horse every day?" the boy asked. "Most days," Caleb answered, without looking up. "Name's Rusty. Been with me since he was a colt. Stubborn as winter, but he'll go where I point him." Samuel considered this. "Our horses ran off. Papa used to say horses know when a man's afraid." Caleb's needle paused just for a heartbeat. "Your papa was right. They feel it in your hands, in your seat. Fear travels faster than thought." Eliza felt a pang, sharp and familiar. She had not spoken of her husband since the funeral, not even to the children beyond the simplest truths. Yet here in the stranger's cabin, the absence felt newly raw. Caleb tied off the thread bit, it clean, then looked at Samuel. You ride much a little. Papa taught me on the old gray mare. She died last spring. Caleb nodded again, absorbing the information the way a man might take the weight of a new fence post. Takes time to learn a new horse. Takes more time to trust one. Samuel leaned forward. Do you have a family? The question hung a moment. Caleb's gaze drifted to the fire. Had a wife once. And a daughter. Fever took them both 7 winters back. Smallpox came through the valley. I was up in the high country hunting when it hit. Came home to an empty house and 2 graves I dug myself. The words were plain delivered without flourish or self-pity, yet they landed like stones in still water. Eliza felt the ripple move through her own chest. She understood the shape of that grief, the way it settled in the marrow and refused to leave. I'm sorry, she said quietly. He met her eyes. Wasn't your doing. Still, the silence that followed carried a different weight, as though 2 people who had each carried their losses alone now recognized the same burden in the other. Outside, the storm howled on indifferent. Inside, the fire popped softly and Clara sighed in her sleep. Caleb rose, checked the latch on the door, then returned to his place on the floor. He did not speak again that night, but when Eliza finally lay down beside her, children pulling the borrowed blanket over them all, she noticed he had placed his own heavy coat across their feet, an extra shield against the creeping cold. She did not sleep right away. Instead, she listened to the rhythm of his breathing, slow and even, and to the wind battering the walls. For the first time in months, she felt something beyond mere survival, the faint, fragile stir of possibility. Not hope, not yet, but the absence of utter despair. In the morning, the storm had eased to a steady fall of large, soft flakes. Caleb was already up boiling coffee, frying salt pork in a blackened skillet. The smell pulled Samuel awake first, then Eliza. They ate together at the small table, the meal simple but warm. No one spoke of leaving. Not yet. Days passed in the small cabin while the snow continued to fall steady and relentless, sealing them in like a promise neither had asked for. The world outside narrowed to white drifts higher than the windowsills, the only sounds the crack of splitting wood Caleb brought in each morning and the soft hiss of the stove. Eliza found rhythm in necessity. She boiled water for washing mended tears in the children's clothes with needle and thread. Caleb lent her without comment, learned the feel of the cabin's few possessions, the weight of the iron skillet, the rough grain of the table where she kneaded dough from flour, kept in a tin bin. Samuel followed Caleb like a shadow. At first, the man tolerated it with quiet patience, answering the boy's endless questions about traps, about the habits of elk in deep snow, about the way a good knife should sit in the hand. Then gradually he began to show rather than tell. He let Samuel hold the whetstone while he sharpened an axe-guided small fingers along the blade's edge, so the boy could feel the burr left by the stone. One afternoon, when the wind dropped enough to allow it, Caleb took Samuel outside to the lean to where Rusty stood, hip-shot in the shelter breath, steaming. He taught the boy how to curry the horse's winter coat, how to check hooves for ice balls, how to speak low and steady, so the animal never startled. Eliza watched from the doorway, arms crossed against the cold that still seeped through the cracks. She saw the way Caleb's shoulders eased when Samuel laughed, a sound so rare these past months. It felt like sunlight breaking cloud. She saw, too, how Caleb sometimes paused mid-sentence, gaze drifting to the far wall, where a small framed tintype hung half-hidden behind a stack of books, a woman with kind eyes and a baby on her hip. He never spoke of them again after that first night, but the photograph remained a silent witness. She herself began to test the edges of this new place. The first morning she rose before him, stoked the fire-set coffee to boil. When he woke and found the pot already steaming, he said nothing, only poured 2 cups and set one beside her without ceremony. She accepted it, their fingers brushing for the barest instant enough to feel callous against callous, warmth against warmth. Later, when Clara fussed with teething fever, Eliza paced the small room with the child on her shoulder. Caleb rose from his chair, took the baby without asking, and walked her in slow circles until the cries quieted. His large hands cradled Clara with a tenderness that made Eliza's throat close. They talked in fragments, never long, never forced. Over supper one night, he told her he had come to this valley 12 years earlier after the war looking for land that asked nothing of a man but his labor. He had filed on a quarter section, built the cabin with his own hands, raised a small herd of cattle that wintered in the sheltered draws. He spoke of the land, the way some men speak of scripture, reverent without sentimentality. "It don't care if you live or die," he said, staring into his plate. "But if you listen, it'll tell you how to stay alive." She told him in pieces about Iowa, the black soil that clung to everything, the way corn grew taller than a man on horseback, the slow dying of her husband's lungs after he breathed too much silo dust one autumn. She spoke of selling the farm to pay debts of the cousin's letter promising a place for her and the children, if she could reach him before winter closed the passes. She did not speak of the night she had lain awake, wondering if she should have accepted one of the widowers who offered marriage as charity. Those thoughts felt distant now, like another woman's life. Trust grew in small, practical ways. She learned to split kindling without splitting her thumb. He learned the exact way she liked her coffee strong, no sugar. Samuel began to call him Caleb instead of Mr. Clara reached for him first when she woke crying in the night. Eliza noticed how Caleb's eyes softened when the girl tugged his beard, how his voice dropped to a murmur when he carried her to the window to watch snowflakes drift against the glass. One evening after the children slept, they sat on opposite sides of the stove, the firelight carving shadows across their faces. She mended a shirt of his that had torn along the seam. He cleaned his rifle with slow, methodical strokes. The silence between them felt full rather than empty. "Do you ever think of going back?" he asked. She considered the question. "Back where there's nothing left there but ghosts and bad debts." He nodded as though he had expected the answer. "And you?" she asked. "You ever think of leaving this place?" He sighted down the barrel, checking for light. "Thought about it once or twice, but the land's got its hooks in me, and I'm not much for towns." Another silence, longer this time. "You're good with them," she said quietly. "The children. They're easy to be good to." He set the rifle aside. "They remind me of what I lost, and what I still want." Her needle stilled. She looked at him across the fire, really looked, and saw not just the scar or the gray in his hair, but the man who had chosen solitude over bitterness, who had kept his grief private but never let it harden him. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "Neither do I," he said. "But we've got time to find out." Outside, the snow fell softer now, blanketing the world in quiet. Inside the stove, sighed, and for the first time in years, Eliza felt the possibility of a future that was not merely endured. The thaw came slow, reluctant, as though winter itself begrudged letting go. By the middle of March, the snow had settled into heavy wet packs that slumped from the cabin eaves in soft thuds during the day and froze again at night. Icicles hung like glass daggers from the porch roof, dripping in slow rhythm when the sun found strength enough to touch them. Eliza stepped outside for the first time without fear of the wind stealing her breath. The air still bit, but it carried the faint mineral promise of earth waking beneath the white. Caleb had cleared a path to the lean-to and the small corral where Rusty cropped the hay he'd forked down from the loft. Samuel helped, dragging a shovel too big for him, cheeks red, breath clouding in excited bursts. Eliza watched them from the doorway, Clara balanced on her hip, the baby's mittened hand clutching a lock of her mother's hair. Something in the sight the man and boy working side by side, heads bent to the same task, made her chest ache in a way that was almost pleasant. That afternoon, Caleb rode out to check his cattle in the lower draws. He returned after dusk with 2 calves slung across Rusty's withers, their legs stiff from cold eyes glassy. One had fallen through thin ice on a creek, The other had followed and nearly drowned beside it. Caleb carried them inside without a word, laid them near the stove on old feed sacks. Eliza knelt at once, rubbing their damp hides with burlap, coaxing warmth back into limbs that had given up. Samuel hovered wide-eyed, offering clumsy pats. Clara, sensing the urgency, stayed quiet on the bunk, watching with solemn gravity. They worked in tandem, unspoken. Caleb heated water. Eliza mixed it with molasses from his pantry and dribbled it into the calves' mouths from a tin cup. Hours passed. One calf began to stir, then the other. By midnight, both were sucking weakly at fingers offered in test. Caleb exhaled a long, slow sound and sat back on his heels. "Thought we'd lose them," he said. Eliza met his gaze across the firelight. "We didn't." He looked at her longer than necessary, then rose to check the door latch, though no one had knocked. The next morning, the calves stood on trembling legs. Samuel named them Patch and Dot for the markings on their foreheads. Caleb let the boy lead them outside when the sun was high, teaching him how to steady a calf without crowding it, how to speak calm so fear didn't travel down the rope. Eliza watched again from the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the lingering chill. She noticed how Caleb's hand rested briefly on Samuel's shoulder when the boy got it right light, almost hesitant, but there. That evening after supper, the children asleep, Caleb sat at the table cleaning his boots with saddle soap. Eliza joined him, working on her own worn pair with a rag. The lamp threw warm pools across the scarred wood between them. "You've got away with him," she said. "Samuel. He's been quiet so long I forgot what his laugh sounded like." Caleb's cloth paused. "He's a good boy. Steady. Reminds me of my brother when we were young. Always watching, learning. You have a brother had. Died at Shiloh. I carried him off the field. Never quite got the blood out of my coat." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, as fact, not confession. Eliza nodded. She understood the habit of carrying old stains. After a moment, she spoke again. "I keep thinking about the cousin in Bitterroot. The letter said, 'Spring work.' I should try to reach him once the trail's clear." Caleb's hands stilled completely. He looked at her, expression unreadable in the lamplight. "You could," he said, "but the valley's still deep in snow above the timberline. Stage won't run for another month, maybe 2. And your cousin's place is a good 3 days' ride past the pass, even in good weather." She felt the weight of his words settle between them. "I don't want to impose," she said. "You're not." The simplicity of it disarmed her. No pleading, no promise, just truth offered like bread. She looked down at the boot in her lap, tracing a crack in the leather with her thumb. "I've spent so long running toward something. I'm not sure I know how to stay." Caleb set his boot aside. "Staying's harder than running. Takes different muscles." She lifted her eyes. His were steady, the blue softened by fire glow. "I've got land here," he said quietly. "Not much by some measures. Cattle, a few horses, this cabin. Enough to feed 4 if we're careful. I've been alone a long time. Thought that was how it would stay. Then you walked out of that storm with 2 children and changed the arithmetic." Her breath caught. Not from surprise, some part of her had felt this gathering for weeks, but from the plainness of it, the absence of poetry or pressure. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm not offering it." Another silence, thick with possibility. "I need time," she told him. "You've got it." He rose, then banked the fire for the night, checked the children one last time. When he passed her chair, he paused, rested a hand briefly on her shoulder, not possessive, only present. Then he went to his blankets on the floor. Eliza sat a long while after he slept, listening to the cabin settle, to the soft snores of her children, to the distant call of a great horned owl, somewhere in the dark pines. She thought of Iowa, of graves and deaths and empty rooms. She thought of the cousin she had never met, the promise that had carried her this far and might carry her farther still. And she thought of the man sleeping a few feet away who had given her shelter without asking her future in payment. Outside, the last of the snow melted from the eaves in slow, steady drops. Spring was coming whether she was ready or not. The first real sign of spring arrived with a Chinook wind that swept down from the mountains in mid-April, warm and dry, carrying the scent of sagebrush and thawing earth. Snow melted in rushing sheets from the slopes, turning the draws into temporary creeks that chuckled over stones. The cabin's roof dripped steadily for 3 days straight, a metronome of change. Eliza stood on the porch one morning, sleeves rolled to her elbows, watching water carve small rivers through the yard while Samuel and Caleb worked to dig drainage trenches so the melt wouldn't undermine the foundation. She felt the shift in her own body, too, the way her shoulders no longer hunched against perpetual cold, the way her hands moved with new certainty when she chopped onions for supper or kneaded bread on the floured table. The children had color in their cheeks again. Claire toddled after Samuel with determined steps, babbling half-words that sounded almost like names. Caleb watched them with a quiet pride he never voiced, though Eliza caught it in the slight upward curve of his mouth when the girl tugged at his pant leg and demanded to be lifted. One afternoon, when the sun hung high and the air smelled of wet pine, Caleb saddled Rusty and another horse he kept for pack work, a steady gray mare named Nell. He rode out with Samuel perched behind him, the boy's arms tight around his waist, to check the upper pasture where the cattle had wintered. They returned at dusk with news of new calves, 7 so far sturdy and loud, and a single lost yearling they'd found half frozen in a thicket. Eliza met them at the corral gate, Clara on her hip, and helped drive the shivering animal into the barn where hay and warmth waited. That night, after the children slept, Caleb sat outside on the porch step, cleaning his rifle by lantern light. Eliza joined him, wrapping herself in the heavy coat he'd once draped over their feet during the storm. The sky had cleared, stars burned cold and bright above the dark line of pines. "You've been thinking about Bitterroot," he said. Not a question. She exhaled, watching her breath curl into the night. "I sent a letter with the supply rider last week. Told my cousin we made it through the winter, that we're safe. Asked if the offer still stood." Caleb's hands paused on the rifle stock. "And no answer yet. Trails are only just opening. Could be weeks before word comes back." He nodded slowly. "You could wait here till then. No hurry." "I know." She looked at him sidelong. "But I keep wondering what I'm waiting for. A promise on paper or something else." He set the rifle across his knees. "I've been wondering the same." The words hung between them, simple and heavy. She felt the old fear rise, the fear of choosing wrong again, of building on sand. But it was quieter now, tempered by months of shared silences and small kindnesses. "I never planned to stay," she admitted. "Not like this. Plans change when the weather turns bad." He glanced at her. "Or when something better comes along." She studied the stars a long moment. "What would staying look like for you?" he considered. "More work, more mouths, less quiet." A small smile touched his mouth. "More laughter in the mornings. Someone to argue with over how strong the coffee should be. Someone to share the load when the calves come early or the wolves get bold. Someone to sit with on nights like this." Her throat tightened. "And for me, land that's yours as much as mine. A place the children can grow roots instead of running from one promise to the next. A man who won't leave when the fever comes or the bank calls the note or the winter turns mean. A life built slow and steady, the way good things are built." She felt tears prick her eyes, not sorrow, but the sharp sting of something long denied finally within reach. She reached out, tentative, and laid her hand over his on the rifle barrel. His skin was warm, rough, familiar now in a way that made her heart stutter. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I," he said. "But I've been scared alone long enough." They sat like that until the lantern wick guttered low and the cold began to creep back under their coats. When they finally went inside, he banked the fire while she checked the children. Then, in the dim glow of embers, he took her hand again and led her to the narrow bunk where she had slept beside her children for months. This time he didn't spread his blankets on the floor. They lay together without haste, without words, at first only the press of bodies learning each other in the dark. His touch was careful, reverent, as though he feared she might vanish like the snow. She traced the old scar on his cheek, felt the steady beat of his heart against her palm. When dawn came gray and soft through the window, they were still tangled, breathing in rhythm, the children stirring in the next room. Outside, the last patches of snow shrank under the strengthening sun. A meadowlark called from the ridge, clear liquid announcing return. Eliza listened to it while Caleb's arm rested heavy and sure across her waist. For the first time since the storm, she did not think of running. The reply from Bitterroot arrived in late May, carried by a grizzled rider whose horse steamed in the warming air. The envelope was thin, the handwriting hurried. Eliza read it, standing in the dooryard while Caleb split wood nearby each stroke of the axe, deliberate and measured. Samuel chased Clara in wide circles through the new grass. Their laughter rose like birds, startled into flight. The cousin wrote politely. The offer of work still stood cooking for the hands, tending the garden, a small cabin of their own behind the main house. Wages modest, but steady room for the children to attend the valley school come fall. Yet the tone carried an undercurrent of caution. The ranch had grown more men on the payroll, winters harsher than remembered. It was no longer the quiet refugee the letter had once promised. Come if you can, the final line read. But come knowing it's hard country. Eliza folded the paper, carefully tucked it into her apron pocket. She walked to where Caleb worked, waited until he paused to wipe sweat from his brow with a sleeve already damp. It's still open, she said. The place in Bitterroot. He rested the axe head on the chopping block. You going? She looked past him to the meadow where wild irises had begun to bloom in purple drifts, to the distant ridge, still patched with snow, but softening day by day. I don't know. He studied her face. You've got choices now. That's more than most get. She nodded slowly. I keep thinking about what Samuel asked me last night. He said, Mama, are we staying or are we going again? I didn't have an answer. Caleb set the axe aside entirely. He's not the only one wondering. They walked together to the creek that bordered the pasture, stepping over new rivulets that glittered in the sun. Willows leaned low, catkins dusting the water's surface. They sat on a flat stone worn smooth by years of high water, shoulders almost touching. I dreamed about my husband last night, she said. Not the sick one at the end. The one who used to carry me across the yard when my feet were cold from the floorboards. He was laughing. Then I woke up here next to you, and for a moment I couldn't remember which life was real. Caleb listened without interrupting, the way he always did. I loved him, she continued. But loving someone doesn't mean the story ends happy. Sometimes it just ends. He reached for a pebble, skipped it across the creek. 3 bounces, then gone. I used to think if I worked hard enough, kept my head down, the past would stay buried. Then you showed up half frozen with 2 kids and proved me wrong. Some things don't stay buried. They just wait for the thaw. She turned to him. If I stay, it's not because I'm afraid to go. It's because I want to build something here. With you. With them. His gaze held hers steady as the creek's current. Then stay. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of decision. That evening after supper, Caleb took Samuel aside while Eliza bathed Clara by the stove. Man and boy walked to the barn where Caleb opened a small chest he kept under the workbench. Inside lay a woman's wedding band, plain gold, worn smooth by years. He lifted it carefully, showed it to the boy. This was my Mary's, he said. I kept it because letting it go felt like forgetting her. But forgetting isn't the same as moving on. Samuel looked up, serious. You gonna give it to Mama? Caleb closed the chest. If she'll have it, and if she wants it. Later, when the house was dark and the children slept, Caleb found Eliza at the table mending by lamplight. He set the ring between them without flourish. She stared at it a long moment, then reached out and slipped it onto her finger. It fit loosely, She had grown thinner since Iowa, but the weight felt right. I don't need a preacher or a paper, she said. Not out here. Neither do I. They stood embraced in the soft glow of the lamp. Outside, a coyote yipped once, answered by another farther off. The night smelled of new grass and wood smoke. Somewhere in the dark, a calf bawled for its mother, and the mother answered low and sure. In the months that followed, the cabin changed by degrees. Caleb built an addition, a small room for Samuel with a window facing east, so the boy could wake to sunrise. Eliza planted a garden behind the house, potatoes, carrots, beans, and a row of hollyhocks she remembered from her mother's yard. Clara learned to walk holding Caleb's finger, then Samuel's, then alone. Neighbors began to ride by, ranchers checking fence lines, a preacher making rounds, nodding at the new smoke from the chimney, the children's voices carrying on the wind. One crisp October morning, when frost silvered the grass and geese arrowed south overhead, Eliza stood on the porch watching Caleb and Samuel ride out to bring the cattle down from summer pasture. Clara slept against her shoulder. The ring on her finger caught the early light. She thought of the storm that had delivered them here, of the graves left behind in Iowa, of promises kept and promises remade. The riders paused at the ridge, Caleb turning in the saddle to look back. He raised a hand. She lifted hers in answer. Then they disappeared over the crest, bound for home. Winter settled in again, quieter this time, as though the land itself had grown accustomed to the new voices within its borders. The cabin stood stronger now, the new room framed and chinked, before the first hard freeze, its window catching the low December sun, a pale gold rectangles across the pine floor. Samuel slept there, though more often than not, he crept back to the main room at dawn, curling between Eliza and Caleb, as though the space between them still felt too wide after so many months of running. The cattle wintered closer to the house this year. Caleb had built a windbreak of stacked logs and brush along the north side of the corral, and every morning he and Samuel walked the perimeter together, checking for breaks in the fence, counting heads through the steam of their breath. Eliza watched from the kitchen window while she stirred oatmeal Clara at her feet, stacking wooden blocks Caleb had whittled smooth. The rhythm of their footsteps on the frozen ground became part of the household music, steady as the tick of the mantel clock. One evening in January, when the cold pressed against the walls like an insistent hand, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing just before full dark. A young man had pulled low coat dusted with snow. Caleb stepped onto the porch rifle, loose in the crook of his arm, not raised but present. Eliza stood behind the half-open door, one hand on the latch. The stranger raised both palms. Name's Tom Whitaker. Ride for the bar T up near the divide. Got word your woman's kin might be looking for her. Caleb didn't move. She's here. Safe. Tom nodded, eyes flicking to the cabin. Her cousin sent me. Says the letter never came back answered, and the stage driver remembered a woman with two young ones, caught in the big October blow. Thought she might have perished. He's offering to send money for train fare if she wants to come south before spring. Eliza stepped fully into the doorway, then shawl pulled tight across her shoulders. Tell him I'm obliged for the thought, but I'm not going. Tom studied her a moment, then touched his hat brim. I'll carry the word. He'll be glad to know you're alive. He turned his horse without waiting for more, disappearing into the falling snow as quietly as he had come. Inside, the stove popped softly. Samuel sat up on his bunk, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Was that about Uncle Henry? Eliza crossed to him, smoothed his hair. Yes. He was worried, but we're staying put. Samuel looked from her to Caleb, who had come in and closed the door against the cold. For good, Caleb met the boy's gaze. For good, if that's what your mama wants. Samuel considered this, then nodded once, small and certain. He lay back down, pulling the quilt to his chin. Later, after Clara's breathing had deepened into the slow cadence of sleep and Samuel's snores came faint through the wall, Eliza and Caleb sat at the table with only the lamp between them. She turned a gold band on her finger, feeling its familiar weight. I thought the past might come knocking one day, she said. Didn't expect it to ride up polite and leave so easy. Caleb poured the last of the coffee into their cups. Some debts get paid just by living through them. She looked at him across the steam. You never asked me to choose. Didn't need to. You chose every morning you stayed. She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. His palm was warm rough from years of rope and reins and axe handles. She thought of the first time he had offered that hand in the blizzard, open steady, asking nothing. How far that single gesture had carried them. Outside the wind, rose rattling the shutters, but it no longer sounded like morning. It sounded like the land breathing, settling, making room. By spring, the garden had been doubled. Eliza planted more hollyhocks along the path to the creek, their tall stalks promising pink and white blooms come July. Caleb taught Samuel to ride Nell without a lead rope, the gray mare patient under the boy's growing confidence. Claire spoke in full sentences, now calling Caleb Pa without hesitation, the words slipping from her mouth as naturally as breath. One soft April afternoon, when the cottonwoods shed their fluff like late snow, Caleb rode back from town with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table without explanation. Eliza opened it to find a silver locket, plain but well-made, and inside 2 tiny daguerreotypes, one of Samuel and Clara taken the previous fall by the itinerant photographer who passed through, the other of the 4 of them standing on the porch, Caleb's arm around her shoulders, the children in front. She closed the locket, pressed it to her lips. That evening they walked to the meadow where the first wild roses had opened small and pink against the green. Caleb carried Clara on his shoulders. Samuel ran ahead, arms wide, pretending to be an eagle. Eliza walked beside her husband, now in every way that mattered, her hand in his. They stopped at the edge of the creek. The water ran clear and fast, carrying last winter's melt toward distant rivers. Caleb knelt, picked a rose and tucked it behind her ear. Still scared, he asked quietly. She smiled, small and sure. Less, every day. He drew her close. Behind them, Samuel laughed as Clara squealed from her perch. The sun dropped behind the ridge, painting the sky in rose and gold. Somewhere a meadowlark sang its evening song, liquid hopeful, claiming tomorrow. They stood there until the light failed and the first stars appeared bright against the deepening blue. Then together they turned toward the cabin where lampglow waited in the windows, warm and steady, a beacon against the coming night. Follow Wild West Chronicles for more legendary tales.